Forget everything you think you know about the Roman Empire. The marble statues, the noble senators in white togas debating philosophy in sunlit courtyards, the glorious legions marching in perfect formation across conquered lands, while grateful civilizations welcomed the gift of Roman order. All of that is a story Rome told about itself, and Rome was extraordinarily good at telling stories. The actual Roman Empire, the one that existed in real time rather than in retrospect, was something considerably stranger and more violent and more darkly comic than the version that ended up in the history books. It was an empire that began with a man who murdered his twin brother over a disagreement about which hill to build a city on. It was an empire where the soldiers who were supposed to protect the emperor routinely murdered him instead, usually when he stopped being sufficiently generous with their wages. It was an empire that lasted, depending on how you count, somewhere between 500 and 2,000 years, which means it either collapsed in late antiquity or survived until the 15th century, and historians are still arguing about which answer is correct. And it was an empire that ended with a final emperor whose name was so perfectly, almost impossibly ironic, that if a novelist had invented it, their editor would have told them to change it. The last emperor of Rome was named Romulus, the same name as the man who founded it. One Romulus began the whole thing. Another Romulus watched it end. And in between those two men, separated by 12 centuries, everything that Rome was and did, and built and destroyed, played out in one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of human civilization. So settle in, get comfortable, 'cause this is going to take a while. And the story, it turns out, was worth every year it took to tell. Let us begin before Rome existed, before the Senate and the legions and the aqueducts and the gladiators and all the things you associate with the word Rome. There was a city on a hill in central Italy called Alba Longa, and in Alba Longa, around the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era, there was a king named Numitor, who was having what can only be described as a very bad week. His younger brother Amulius wanted the throne. In the ancient world, wanting the throne and taking it were frequently the same act, separated only by the logistical question of how quickly you could eliminate the people standing between you and it. Amulius solved this problem with the directness that characterized Roman political thinking from its earliest days. He overthrew his brother, killed Numitor's sons, and then, in a move that has the distinction of being both extremely clever and genuinely terrible, forced Numitor's surviving daughter, a young woman named Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal Virgin. The Vestal Virgins were priestesses sworn to celibacy. No children meant no heirs. No heirs meant no rival claim to the throne. Amulius had just solved his succession problem with a single religious appointment. He was probably very pleased with himself. He should have known better. Because if there is one thing the mythology of Rome teaches you, it is that the universe has a very specific sense of humor about powerful men who think they have thought of everything. Rhea Silvia became pregnant. The father, according to the story that Rome told about itself for the next 1,000 years, was Mars, the god of war. Whether you choose to believe that particular detail is between you and your own theology, but the consequences were real, regardless of the parentage. Twin boys were born. Their names were Romulus and Remus. Amulius, discovering that his careful plan had produced the exact result he had been trying to prevent, did what tyrants throughout history have done when confronted with inconvenient infants. He ordered them drowned in the Tiber River. The servants tasked with this job, either from mercy or from a reluctance to do the specific thing they had been asked to do, placed the boys in a basket and left them at the river's edge instead. The basket drifted downstream and lodged in the roots of a fig tree at the foot of the Palatine hill. A she-wolf found them. She did not eat them, which would have made for a considerably shorter story. She nursed them instead, as a woodpecker brought them food, because apparently the god of war had strong feelings about the survival of his sons, and had briefed the local wildlife accordingly. Eventually, a shepherd named Faustulus found the twins, took them home, and raised them as his own children. And here is where the story moves from mythology into something that feels almost plausible, because what followed was not miraculous, it was political. The boys grew up strong and capable, and popular among the local herdsmen. They learned who they were, they gathered followers, they marched on Alba Longa, they overthrew Amulius, restored their grandfather Numitor to his throne, and then, presumably feeling that they had done enough for their family's political situation, decided to build a city of their own. They chose the banks of the Tiber River. They had 7 hills to choose from, and 2 strong opinions about which one to use. This is where the founding myth of Rome gets its darkest moment, and its most Roman one. Romulus wanted the Palatine Hill. Remus wanted the Aventine. They agreed to let the gods decide, by watching for birds, an augury, a practice of reading divine intention from the behavior of birds that Rome would continue to take seriously for centuries. Remus saw 6 vultures first, then Romulus saw 12, or Romulus saw his 12 first, and Remus's 6 came after. The accounts disagree, in the way that accounts of things that happened 3,000 years ago tend to disagree. What is consistent across all versions is what happened next. The argument escalated. Romulus began building a wall around the Palatine Hill to mark his city's boundary. Remus, to demonstrate his contempt for this wall, jumped over it. Romulus killed him, his own twin brother, over a wall and a boundary dispute, and a question of precedence that could have been settled by a coin flip, but was not, because this was Rome, and Rome would always rather have a war than a negotiation when a war was available. The city built on that act of fratricide was called Rome, after the man who committed it, and the spirit of that founding moment, the willingness to destroy even the closest relationship in the service of dominance, ran through Roman history like a thread you can follow all the way to the end. Romulus became the first king. Rome at this stage was less a city than an idea with walls. The population consisted largely of escaped slaves, exiled criminals, runaway debtors, and the general category of men who had made poor decisions elsewhere and were hoping that a new city, with no history, and therefore no record of their previous poor decisions, might offer a fresh start. Romulus looked at this collection of desperate and marginal people and declared it a city. He was not wrong, exactly. Rome has always been better understood as a project than as a place. And the project began here, with this unpromising raw material, on this specific hill, in this specific moment. The first problem was immediately apparent. The city had men. It did not have women. And without women, the city had no future beyond its current generation. Romulus solved this problem with an ingenuity that was, again, both extremely clever and genuinely terrible. He invited the neighboring Sabine people to a festival, a large festival, well supplied with food and entertainment, the kind of event that would attract families. The Sabines came, the festival began, and at a signal from Romulus, the Roman men grabbed the Sabine women and carried them off. This event, known in history as the rape of the Sabine women, using the older meaning of the word rape, which means abduction, rather than its modern meaning, though the distinction probably seemed academic to the women involved, was Rome's solution to its demographic problem. The Sabine men, understandably furious, attacked Rome. The Sabine women, caught between their new Roman husbands and their furious families, intervened. They walked between the armies and told both sides to stop, and remarkably, both sides did. The Sabines and Romans merged into a single people. Rome had solved its population problem through theft, and then solved the consequences of the tall theft through the willingness of the women it had stolen to broker a peace their abductors could not have negotiated themselves. This, too, was very Roman. 6 more kings followed Romulus, each of them adding something to the city that would persist long after the monarchy itself was gone. Numa Pompilius created the Roman religious calendar and built the temples that gave Roman civic life its sacred dimension. Tullus Hostilius was a man who found religion genuinely uninteresting and war genuinely compelling, which made him a useful, if dangerous, king. Ancus Marcius built Rome's first prison and its first bridge across the Tiber, which tells you something about the priorities of early Roman civic planning. Tarquinius Priscus began the construction of the Circus Maximus, which would eventually become a venue capable of holding 250,000 spectators, because Rome believed that people needed bread and entertainment to remain governable, and was correct about this. Servius Tullius reorganized Roman society and extended the city walls. And then there was the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, whose surname Superbus meant the proud, and whose behavior was so comprehensively awful that the Romans abolished the monarchy entirely rather than risk producing another one like him. He ruled by terror. He murdered his predecessors. He ignored the Senate. He used forced labor to build public works, which is a reasonable description of how most ancient construction happened, but which in his case was combined with enough general cruelty that it became the final item in a long list of grievances that ended with the Roman people throwing him out of the city in 509 BCE. Rome declared that it would never again have a king. It meant it for about 500 years. Then it changed its mind, renamed the position, and went back to having one person in charge of everything. But those 500 years in between produced something genuinely extraordinary, and that something was the Roman Republic. The Republic was built on a principle that the Romans had learned from watching Tarquinius Superbus, which was that concentrating power in a single person was dangerous. Their solution was elegant in theory and chaotic in practice. Instead of one king, they elected two consuls who held equal power and could veto each other. The consuls served for 1 year and then had to give up their offices. Additional magistrates, including praetors, censors, quaestors, and aediles, divided the practical tasks of government among themselves. The Senate, composed of former magistrates and appointed members, advised the consuls and controlled the treasury. And the popular assemblies gave ordinary Roman citizens, at least the male ones, a voice in electing magistrates and passing laws. It was, for its time and place, a remarkable system. It was also a system that worked beautifully as long as everyone agreed to follow the rules, and catastrophically badly the moment anyone decided that the rules were optional. The history of the Roman Republic is largely the history of the moment when several people decided simultaneously that the rules were optional, and of the civil wars that followed that decision. Before those civil wars, though, Rome had to become Rome. The city on the Palatine Hill in 509 BCE controlled a relatively small territory in central world. The empire that Julius Caesar would inherit 4.5 centuries later controlled most, the Mediterranean world. The distance between those 2 points was covered through a combination of military excellence, political flexibility, and the Roman talent for absorbing the people they first conquered and making Romans of them with a thoroughness that no other ancient empire quite matched. The Roman army was the mechanism by which territory was acquired, but it was Roman citizenship and Roman law that held acquired territory together. When Rome conquered a Latin city, it typically offered the inhabitants a path to Roman citizenship. When it conquered a Greek city in southern Italy, it absorbed Greek culture so enthusiastically that the Romans eventually said, with genuine admiration, that captured Greece had captured its captor. Rome was not merely an empire of soldiers, it was an empire of lawyers and administrators and road builders and engineers, and these people were in many ways more important to Rome's survival than the legions. The legions deserve their moment. A Roman legion at full strength consisted of approximately 5,000 heavy infantry, soldiers, the legionaries, supported by cavalry and specialist troops. The legionaries were professional soldiers who enlisted for a term of service, initially 20 years, received regular pay and standardized equipment, and trained constantly in the tactics that made the Roman army the most effective military force in the ancient world. The core of Roman military effectiveness was not individual fighting skill, though Roman soldiers were certainly trained to fight, but unit cohesion and tactical flexibility. The legion could deploy in different formations depending on the terrain and the opponent. It could build a fortified camp at the end of every day's march, which meant that a Roman army on campaign was never truly vulnerable, even in hostile territory, because it carried its defenses with it. And it could, when necessary, sustain losses that would shatter most ancient armies and keep fighting, because the training and the discipline and the sense of unit identity were deep enough to hold the formation even when individual men were dying. The wars that built the empire came in phases. First, Rome secured Italy, fighting a series of campaigns against neighboring peoples that took the better part of 2 centuries and ended with most of the Italian peninsula either conquered or allied with Rome. Then came Carthage. Carthage was a city on the northern coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia, and it was Rome's only serious rival for dominance of the western Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were a maritime power with a vast commercial empire, a professional army that included war elephants, and enough money to hire the best mercenary soldiers in the ancient world. The 3 Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage, which lasted from 264 to 146 BCE, were the crucible in which the Roman military machine was truly forged. The first war was fought primarily at sea, which was a problem for Rome because Rome did not have a navy. The Romans solved this problem in a way that was characteristically Roman. They found a Carthaginian warship that had run aground, copied its design, built 120 ships in 60 days, and then trained their crews to fight by practicing rowing on benches set up on dry land. They then went to sea and won. The Second Punic War produced Hannibal Barca, the Carthaginian general who marched an army of 50,000 soldiers and 37 war elephants across the Alps in winter, and then spent 15 years winning battles on Italian soil, while Rome, slowly, painfully, and at enormous cost in blood and resources, refused to give up. Hannibal won every major engagement he fought in Italy. He won so comprehensively and so repeatedly that most enemies would have surrendered. Rome did not surrender. Rome instead sent armies to Spain and Africa, threatening Carthage's own territory, and eventually forced Hannibal to return home, where he was defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama in 2002 BCE. The Third Punic War ended with Rome besieging and destroying Carthage so thoroughly that the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, became one of the most famous in Roman history. A city that had existed for 700 years was reduced to rubble. Its survivors were enslaved, and whether the Romans actually salted the earth where it had stood, which modern historians doubt, but which ancient sources suggested, the message was clear. Rome did not merely defeat its enemies, it unmade them. With Carthage gone, Rome expanded in every direction. Greece fell. Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, was absorbed. Syria, Judea, Egypt, Gaul, which is modern France, Britain up to its northern highlands, Spain, and vast stretches of North Africa, all became Roman provinces over the following 2 centuries. At its peak, under the Emperor Trajan, in 117 CE, the Roman Empire covered approximately 2.2 million square miles and contained somewhere between 50 and 90 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's entire population. Every one of those people, regardless of where they had been born or what language they spoke, or what gods they worshipped, lived under Roman law, used Roman roads, paid Roman taxes, and conducted their business in one of two official languages, Latin in the West and Greek in the East. This was something genuinely unprecedented. No civilization before Rome had managed to integrate such a diversity of peoples and places under a single administrative system with sufficient coherence for it to function. The roads alone were a miracle of engineering and ambition. Rome built approximately 85,000 kilometers of road, all of it paved with stone, all of it following precise engineering standards that maintained consistent gradients and for drainage, all of it connected to every other road in the system. The phrase, "all roads lead to Rome," was not a metaphor. It was a description of a real infrastructure that made it possible to travel from the Scottish border to the Euphrates River on paved roads, stopping at regular intervals at rest stations, way stations, and military posts that provided fresh horses, food, and accommodation. Nothing like this existed anywhere else on Earth. Nothing like it would exist again for 1,500 years. But between the Republic and the Empire, between the city that had expelled Tarquinius Superbus and the empire that Trajan ruled, there was a crisis. A long, bloody, spectacular crisis that produced some of the most dramatic personalities in Western history, and ended with the Republic becoming something it had spent 5 centuries swearing it would never become, a monarchy. With a different name, the crisis had structural causes that historians have spent 2,000 years analyzing, and if you distilled them to their essence, the answer would be this. The Roman system of government was designed for a city-state, and Rome had become a world empire without redesigning its government. The Senate and the consuls and the popular assemblies worked when everyone who mattered could walk to the forum in an afternoon. They stopped working when the territory they needed to govern stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. The armies that protected those territories were commanded by generals, and those generals, serving far from Rome for years at a time, found that their soldiers' loyalty was to them personally, rather than to the abstract institution of the Republic. And when a general came back to Rome with a loyal army at his back, and political enemies waiting in the Senate, the temptation to use the one to deal with the other was enormous. Sulla did it in 88 BCE. Caesar did it in 49 BCE. And each time a general marched on Rome, the precedent made the next general more likely to try the same thing. Julius Caesar deserves his own moment, because he was the pivot point. The man around whom the late Republic turned, and who the Republic destroyed itself, trying to stop. Caesar was, by any measure, one of the most capable human beings who ever lived. He was a military commander of genius, who conquered the whole of Gaul in 8 years of continuous campaigning, and then invaded Britain twice, apparently just to see if he could. He was a politician of extraordinary skill, who built alliances and diffused enemies with a facility that made him seem to his opponents like he was operating on information they did not have. He was a writer whose accounts of his own campaigns are still considered models of clear, economical Latin prose. He reformed the Roman calendar, which had become so confused by political manipulation that it was 3 months out of alignment with the actual seasons, into the Julian calendar that remained in use across Europe for the next 1,500 years, and from which our modern calendar is directly descended. The month of July is named after him. He was in the middle of a vast program of administrative reform when the Senate decided he was too dangerous to be allowed to live. 23 senators stabbed him to death in the theatre of Pompey on the Ides of March, 44 BCE. He was 55 years old. The Senate believed they had saved the Republic. They had ended it. The immediate consequence of Caesar's assassination was not the restoration of republican virtue, but another civil war, because the men who killed Caesar had not made a plan for what happened next. Mark Antony, Caesar's friend and lieutenant, took control of Rome almost immediately by reading Caesar's will to the Roman public, and reminding them that the senators who had killed Caesar were the same senators who had been blocking Caesar's popular reforms. The assassins fled, and then into this chaos stepped a young man who most observers initially dismissed as a minor figure because he was only 18 years old, had never commanded an army, and was sick with illness at the time of the assassination. His name was Gaius Octavius. He was Caesar's great-nephew and, as the will revealed, Caesar's adopted son and primary heir. History knows him as Augustus. What Augustus did over the following 17 years was one of the most remarkable political achievements in human history. He defeated Mark Antony in a civil war, partly through military force, and partly through the masterful propaganda campaign that portrayed Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man who had seduced and corrupted by Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. He consolidated control of the Roman state without ever claiming the title of king, which he knew the Romans would not accept, by instead accumulating a combination of existing republican offices that together gave him absolute power, while maintaining the fiction that the republic's institutions remained intact. He called himself the first citizen, princeps in Latin, rather than king or emperor, and the Senate gratefully accepted this arrangement because it meant they could pretend nothing fundamental had changed, while actually having no power to prevent anything Augustus chose to do. He held this position for 41 years, during which the empire was more stable and more prosperous than it had been in a century. When he died in 14 CE, the Roman population had largely forgotten what the Republic had actually felt like from the inside, and the institution of the emperor was so firmly established that the question was no longer whether Rome would have one, but which member of which family would be next. The emperors who followed Augustus ranged from competent to genuinely alarming. Tiberius, his stepson and successor, was an able administrator who was also deeply paranoid, and eventually retreated to the island of Capri, running the empire through letters, while in Rome, a man named Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, used his proximity to the absent emperor to accumulate power that made him effectively the second most important person in the Roman world. This would become a pattern. The Praetorian Guard was the emperor's personal bodyguard, a force of approximately 10,000 elite soldiers permanently stationed in Rome. They were supposed to protect the emperor. In practice, they protected the emperor when the emperor was generous and murdered him when he was not, or when someone more generous was offering to pay them for switching loyalties. The number of Roman emperors killed by their own Praetorian Guard is a figure that historians have to count carefully because it is startlingly high. Caligula, who succeeded Tiberius, was killed by the Praetorian Guard in 41 CE. The Guard then chose his successor themselves, finding a man named Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declaring him emperor on the spot. Claudius, despite having been chosen by soldiers who found him hiding behind curtains, turned out to be a reasonably effective emperor who oversaw the conquest of Britain and strengthened Roman administration. He was probably poisoned by his wife, who wanted her son Nero to be emperor instead. Nero is one of those historical figures whose reputation is almost certainly worse than his reality, though his reality was genuinely bad enough that there is not much room between the two. He was 17 years old when he became emperor. He spent his early reign under the guidance of competent advisors, and by most accounts governed reasonably well. Then the advisors died or lost influence, and Nero was left to make his own decisions, which were frequently catastrophic. He had his own mother killed. He kicked his pregnant wife to death. He blamed the Christians for a fire that burned a significant portion of Rome in 64 CE, though whether Nero actually set the fire himself, as later tradition suggested, or whether it was genuinely accidental, is something historians still debate. He spent money on personal projects with such reckless enthusiasm that he repeatedly debased the currency to finance them, which contributed to an inflationary spiral that damaged the Roman economy for decades. When he finally lost the support of the army and the Senate, and understood that he was going to be captured and executed, he fled Rome and killed himself with the help of a secretary, reportedly saying as he died that the world was losing a great artist. He was not entirely wrong about his artistic abilities. He was very wrong about everything else. After Nero came the year of the 4 emperors, which is exactly what it sounds like. In 69 CE, 4 different men held the position of Roman emperor in a single calendar year. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian all claimed the throne, the first 3 in rapid and violent succession, before Vespasian emerged as the final victor, primarily because he had the loyalty of the Eastern legions and therefore the largest army. The year of the 4 emperors made something explicit that the previous century had been, suggesting the emperor was whoever controlled the army, not whoever had the best bloodline, or the strongest claim, or the most legitimate succession. Whoever the soldiers decided to follow, this reality would destabilize Rome repeatedly over the following centuries, producing periods of extraordinary chaos during which the empire went through emperors at a rate that made comprehensive record-keeping difficult. The period from Vespasian through Marcus Aurelius, roughly 69 to 180 CE, is sometimes called the era of the 5 good emperors, and the name is broadly accurate. These men, Vespasian and his sons Titus and Domitian, then Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius, governed the empire with a combination of competence and relative restraint that produced the most stable and prosperous period in Roman history. Trajan expanded the empire to its maximum extent, reaching into what is now Romania and Iraq. Hadrian consolidated it, building the famous wall across northern Britain that marked the northern limit of Roman ambition. The Colosseum was completed under Vespasian and inaugurated under Titus with 100 days of games. Aqueducts and roads and public buildings went up across the empire. The population grew, trade flourished, and ordinary people living in the shadow of the empire, if they were lucky enough to be in a peaceful province rather than on a contested frontier, had access to a level of infrastructure and legal protection that was genuinely remarkable for the ancient world. Then Commodus became emperor, and things went wrong in the specific way that things go wrong when a position of absolute power is occupied by someone who is both unstable and deeply invested in his own divine status. Commodus believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He appeared in the arena in lion skins and carried a club, fighting gladiatorial bouts in which his opponents were advised not to win. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He was assassinated in 192 CE by a conspiracy that included a wrestler named Narcissus, who strangled him in his bath, and the empire entered another period of instability that made the year of the 4 emperors look like a brief interruption. The 3rd century CE saw no fewer than 26 claimants to the imperial throne in 50 years, most of them dying violently, while plague reduced the population. Germanic tribes pressed on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and the Persian Sassanid Empire threatened in the east. The Roman Empire, which had seemed permanent and invincible at its peak, suddenly looked like something that could actually end. Diocletian saved it, temporarily, through radical administrative surgery. He understood that the empire was too large and too complex to be governed by a single person from a single city, particularly when that city, Rome itself, was now far from every frontier that needed defending. He created the Tetrarchy, a system of 4 co-rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, who divided the empire between them and governed from cities closer to the frontiers than Rome. It was an ingenious solution to a real problem, and it worked for as long as the 4 men involved were willing to cooperate. The moment Diocletian retired, which he did voluntarily in 305 CE, to grow cabbages in his retirement palace in what is now Croatia, the Tetrarchy collapsed into civil war because the 4 successors had different ideas about cooperation. Constantine eventually emerged from this chaos as sole emperor, achieved what might be the single most consequential individual decision in Roman history, and then built a new city. The decision was to legalize Christianity. The Edict of Milan, in 313 CE, issued jointly by Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, established religious tolerance throughout the empire, ending the persecution of Christians that had been official policy in various periods throughout the preceding 2 centuries. Whether Constantine genuinely converted to Christianity or adopted it for political reasons is a question that historians still debate, and the honest answer is probably that the distinction between those 2 things was not as clear to Constantine as it might seem to us. What is not debatable is the consequence. Christianity went from a persecuted minority religion to the officially favored faith of the most powerful state in the Western world within a single generation, and the implications of that transformation are still unfolding. The new city was Constantinople, built on the site of the old Greek city of Byzantium, on a narrow peninsula between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Constantine chose the location with the eye of a military strategist. The site was almost impregnable, surrounded by water on 3 sides, with a narrow neck of land that could be defended by walls, in the perfect choke point between Europe and Asia. He built it to be magnificent, importing art and columns and statuary from across the empire to furnish the new capital. And he built it to be Christian, constructing churches rather than temples as its defining architectural statements. Constantinople became the effective center of the Roman Empire, and as it grew richer and more powerful, Rome itself declined into something closer to a symbolic capital, important for its history and its name, but no longer the genuine center of power. The split between East and West that Constantine had begun became formalized in 395 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius died and divided the empire between his 2 sons. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, was wealthier, more urbanized, and more stable. The western half, centered nominally on Rome, but governed from other cities like Milan and Ravenna, was poorer, more fragmented, and under constant pressure from the peoples moving across its frontiers. And they were moving. The Huns, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, had erupted into Eastern Europe with a violence so extreme that it set the other peoples of the region in motion like a shockwave. The Visigoths, the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Burgundians, the Franks, all of these peoples, many of whom had lived peacefully near the Roman frontier for generations, were suddenly either fleeing the Huns or taking advantage of the chaos the Huns created to move into Roman territory. Rome could not stop them, not because the Roman army was weak, though it had weakened considerably from its peak, but because the scale of the movement was too large and too fast, and because the Western Empire no longer had the administrative capacity to respond effectively to a crisis of this magnitude. What it had instead was a series of short-reigned emperors, many of them children controlled by generals of Germanic origin, making deals with armed groups they could not defeat. In 410 CE, the Visigoth king Alaric sacked Rome, not conquered it, not occupied it, but sacked it, looted it, walked through the walls of the Eternal City, which had not been breached by an enemy in 800 years, and spent 3 days taking what could be carried. The psychological impact on the Roman world was enormous. Augustine of Hippo, writing in North Africa, would spend the next 14 years producing The City of God, in partial response to the question that the sack of Rome raised for Roman Christians. If Rome had been protected by God after its conversion to Christianity, why had God allowed this? The city that had defined civilization for 1,000 years had been sacked like any other city, and nothing would quite be the same again. The end, when it came, was less dramatic than the preceding century might have suggested. On September 4, 476 CE, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer forced the last Western Roman emperor to abdicate. The emperor's name was Romulus Augustulus, a name so loaded with irony that it almost seems too neat for history. Romulus like the founder, Augustulus meaning Little Augustus, a diminutive of the title of the first emperor, as if history were making a point about the distance between beginning and end. Romulus Augustulus was 14 years old. He had been emperor for 10 months. He was not killed. Odoacer gave him a pension and sent him to live in a comfortable villa in southern Italy, which suggests that even the man ending the Roman Empire did not think of himself as doing something dramatic. He was simply dealing with an administrative inconvenience. Romulus Augustulus presumably lived out the rest of his days in reasonable comfort, and, whether he ever fully understood that he was the last emperor of the Roman Empire in the West, is something we do not know. But the Eastern Empire continued. Constantinople stood behind its walls and its sea barriers and its considerable wealth, and the empire centered on it remained the Roman Empire in its own understanding and that of its neighbors for another 1,000 years. The Byzantine Empire, as modern historians call it, survived the fall of the West by a millennium, fighting off Arab armies and Bulgar invasions, and crusaders who came to help and stayed to conquer, maintaining Roman law and Roman administration, and the Greek language and the Christian faith until 1453 CE, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II brought his army and his enormous cannons to the walls of Constantinople and breached them after a siege of 53 days. The last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire was Constantine XI, who died fighting on the walls of his city. His body was never definitively identified. He disappeared into the chaos of the fall, which is in its own way a more fitting ending than a pension and a comfortable villa. 1,200 years of continuous Roman history ended not with a document or a proclamation, but with an emperor who chose to die with his city rather than surrender it. The city that had been built to last forever changed hands on a Tuesday in May, and Rome, the idea, if not the place, finally ended. But Rome does not end the way empires usually end. Most empires fall and leave behind ruins and artifacts and the memory of their power, and gradually those things recede into history and the world moves on. Rome fell and continued to shape everything that came after it. The legal systems of most of Western Europe are descended from Roman law. The calendar you use is the Julian calendar, adjusted by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, but based on the reform Julius Caesar made in 46 BCE. The languages of France, Spain, Italy, Portugal, Romania, and through these countries, the languages of their former colonies, including all of Latin America, are descended from Latin. The Catholic Church preserved and transmitted Roman administrative structures even as the Entente was disintegrating. The word emperor is derived from imperator. The word senate is Latin. The word republic is Latin. The concept of citizenship, the idea that belonging to a political community confers specific rights and protections that the community is obligated to uphold, is a Roman contribution to human political thought that has never entirely gone away. Rome built roads through your language and your legal systems and your calendar and your concept of what a city should look like and what a government should do. You live in a world that is still, in ways you rarely pause to notice, shaped by decisions made in a city on 7 hills in central Italy more than 2,000 years ago. The roads are still there, not the original stone pavement, but the roots, because Roman roads were built on the most logical paths between important places, and logical paths between important places are still logical paths between important places 2,000 years later. The walls of Rome are still there, in places, still standing after 16 centuries of everything the world has thrown at them. The aqueducts are still there, some of them still carrying water, and the Pantheon, built by Augustus's son-in-law Agrippa and rebuilt by Hadrian in 105 CE, still stands in Rome with its unreinforced concrete dome intact after 1900 years, the oldest intact dome on Earth, a building that was ancient when the medieval cathedrals that modeled themselves on it were being built. Rome was not good in the ways we might wish a civilization to be good. It was built on slavery. It conquered peoples who had not asked to be conquered, and did not benefit from the arrangement. It was frequently brutal, and always hierarchical, and consistently willing to use violence as a first resort, when a second resort might have served as well. These things are true, and they matter, and they should not be minimized in the story. But Rome was also the first civilization in Western history to govern a genuinely diverse empire of many millions of people under a single legal system that applied, imperfectly and selectively, but really, to all of them. It built infrastructure so durable that it still shapes the world. It developed a tradition of law and administration that has never entirely disappeared from human political life. And it told a story about itself so compelling that every subsequent Western civilization has spent 2,000 years arguing about what it meant and what lessons it taught and how to apply those lessons to the present moment. The empire that began with one man murdering his twin brother over a hill is still, in some sense, not entirely over. It ended, but did not disappear. It became something else, and that something else became something else still, and the thread that connects you to Romulus, murderer of his brother and founder of cities, is thinner than a hair, but has never quite broken. Tonight, in the dark, in the particular stillness of a mind releasing the day's grip on things, that thread is just another of the invisible lines that connect you to everything that came before you and made you possible. The Roman road ran through here once. In a sense, it always does. Let that thought settle now, gently, into the quiet space where sleep is forming. The empire rose. The empire fell. 12 centuries of continuity in the East. 15 centuries of influence in everything that came after. And now, here, in the dark, at the end of a story that took 2,000 years to tell, there is nothing required of you. Not citizenship, not taxes, not loyalty to an emperor, or obedience to a senate, or service in a legion. Just this: rest. The night is old. The road has run its length. Sleep now, in the silence that follows the fall of every empire, which is the same silence that precedes the rise of the next thing, which has not yet declared itself, which is waiting, as everything waits, in the dark. Sleep now. Sleep well. The daily life of an ordinary Roman citizen inside the empire, at its peak, is worth pausing on, because it is so different from what the word Roman conjures in most imaginations, and so different from what it was outside the empire's borders, that the contrast itself tells you something important about what Rome actually was, and why people who had no particular affection for Roman conquest eventually found themselves participating in Roman civilization anyway. If you were an ordinary person living in a Roman provincial city in, say, 100 CE, under the Emperor Trajan, your morning began in a way that was not entirely unlike a morning in a modern Mediterranean city. You woke in a multi-story apartment building, an insula, which could be up to 7 stories tall, though the upper floors were cheaper and more dangerous, because the construction quality declined the higher you went, and because fires, which were extremely common in Roman cities, were harder to escape from the upper floors. You dressed, which in your case meant a tunic if you were a man, and possibly a toga if you were a Roman citizen attending something official, though the toga was heavy and impractical, and most Roman men wore it only when they had to. You went downstairs, possibly stopping at the ground floor shop that occupied the street-level space of your building, which might sell food or wine or pottery or any number of things you did not cook at home. The risk of fire in an apartment building was too high for most people to have cooking fires in their rooms. You ate at one of the numerous thermopolia, Roman fast food establishments, where food was kept warm in ceramic pots, set into a stone counter, and you could get a meal quickly and cheaply. The city around you had paved streets, sewers, a water supply delivered by aqueduct, public fountains at regular intervals, public baths where you could wash yourself and socialize and conduct business for a small fee, and public toilets that were simultaneously more civilized than what most of the ancient world offered, and less civilized than what we would consider acceptable, since Roman public toilets were communal benches over running water where privacy was not a concept that had been incorporated into the design. You had access to the law, not equal access, because Roman society was intensely hierarchical, and your position in that hierarchy determined how the law treated you, but some access, because Roman law was written down and administered by magistrates who were theoretically bound by it. You could buy and sell things using a standardized currency that was accepted across the entire Mediterranean world. You could travel on the roads. If you were sick and wealthy, you could consult a doctor who, while operating in complete ignorance of germ theory, had access to a pharmacopoeia of herbal treatments and surgical techniques that were more sophisticated than anything available in most of the contemporary world. If you were not wealthy, you could visit a temple and hope that the god was listening. If you were very sick and not wealthy, and the temple was not helping, you probably died, which brings us to the other side of the picture. Roman society rested on slavery. Not incidentally, not as a minor feature of an otherwise admirable civilization, but fundamentally and structurally. At the peak of the empire, approximately 30% of the population of Italy was enslaved. The slave population of the entire empire was in the tens of millions. These were human beings who had been captured in war, or born to enslaved mothers, or sold into slavery through poverty and debt, and who had no legal rights whatsoever and were considered the property of their owners in the same category as furniture or livestock. The treatment of enslaved people in Rome ranged from what we might describe as the relatively benign household slaves who developed relationships with their owners and were sometimes freed in later life, to the genuinely horrific, the enslaved men who worked in the silver mines of Spain or the grain fields of Sicily in conditions so brutal that their life expectancy after entering those conditions was measured in months rather than years. The gladiatorial games, which Rome presented to itself and to the world as entertainment and civic ceremony, were fought primarily by enslaved people and condemned criminals. The marble and the aqueducts and the roads were built with enslaved labor. The surplus that allowed wealthy Romans to pursue philosophy and politics and military careers while their estates generated income was produced by enslaved agricultural workers, who had no share in the surplus they created. Rome was magnificent, and Rome was monstrous, and it was the same Rome doing both things simultaneously, which is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but is the truth of what it was. The food of Rome is worth dwelling on because it tells you something about the extent of the served and the sophistication of its trade networks that is not immediately obvious from the political and military history. An ordinary Roman in a provincial city could eat bread made from grain that might have come from Egypt or North Africa, the breadbasket provinces that fed the empire's cities. They could buy garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans used the way we use salt, produced in factories along the Atlantic coast of Spain and Gaul, and shipped in amphoras across the entire empire. They could drink wine from vineyards in Italy, Spain, Greece, or France. They could buy olive oil, pressed in Spain or North Africa. They could, if they were wealthy, purchase spices from India and silk from China, carried along the trade routes that connected the Roman world to the Asian world at its farthest edges. The Roman economy was genuinely international in a way that no previous civilization had been, because the roads and the currency and the legal framework made long-distance trade possible in a way it had not been before. A merchant in Alexandria could buy goods from a trader in London with a reasonable expectation that the transaction would be enforceable under the same legal system in both places. This was new. This was Rome. The Romans thought about time differently than we do, and this is worth understanding because it explains something about how they understood their own civilization. The Roman concept of time was not linear in the modern sense. Romans did not think of themselves as living in a story that was progressing toward some future destination. They thought of themselves as living inside a story that had a definite and glorious beginning, the founding by Romulus, and that was perpetually engaged in the project of living up to that beginning. The past was not behind them. It was the standard against which the present was measured. The ancestral customs, the mos maiorum, the ways of the ancestors, were not nostalgic references to a simpler time. They were the active governing principles by which good Romans were supposed to live in the present. When Augustus built the Forum of Augustus with a gallery of statues of great Romans of the past, he was not building a museum, he was building a living argument about what Rome was and what Romans should aspire to be. When Cicero made speeches in the Senate, invoking the example of ancient heroes, he was not making historical references. He was asserting that the present moment should be measured against a permanent standard that existed outside of time. This relationship with the past made Rome simultaneously conservative and dynamic, deeply committed to tradition and capable of enormous innovation, because innovation was acceptable as long as it could be framed as a return to ancestral virtue rather than a departure from it. The Roman relationship with religion was equally complex and equally unlike what the word religion usually suggests to a modern reader. Roman religion was not primarily about belief, it was about practice. The Romans had a vast pantheon of gods, mostly inherited from the Etruscans and the Greeks, and the correct relationship with these gods was maintained not through personal faith or theological conviction, but through the proper performance of the correct rituals at the correct times. The sacrifices and the auguries and the festivals and the prayers were contracts, essentially, between the Roman people and the gods. You performed the ritual correctly, you received divine favor. You neglected the ritual or performed it incorrectly, you risked divine displeasure. And divine displeasure in the Roman understanding was not abstract spiritual punishment, but very practical bad outcomes, like crop failures and military defeats and plagues. This transactional view of religion made the Romans, paradoxically, pudchimvrous, both highly tolerant and genuinely ferocious when they felt threatened. They were tolerant of foreign religions because they recognized that the gods of conquered peoples might be real and might be worth propitiating, which is why Roman temples to Egyptian, Syrian, and Persian gods could be found across the empire. They were ferocious when they felt that a religion threatened the social order, which is why they persecuted the Christians, not primarily because of theological disagreement, but because the Christians refused to perform the civic religious rituals that Romans believed kept the state safe. Christian refusal to sacrifice to Roman gods was not, from the Roman perspective, a matter of individual conscience. It was a dangerous act of civic negligence that put everyone at risk. The Roman legions in the field were a civilization in miniature, and the life of a Roman soldier deserves more than a passing mention because it was the daily reality of the millions of men who served in the army over the centuries of the empire. A legionary enlisted for 20 years. During those 20 years, he would march approximately 20 miles a day. When on campaign, carrying equipment that weighed somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds, which included his weapons, his personal cooking equipment, his tools for building the camp that the legion erected at the end of every day's march, and enough food for several days. He was not allowed to marry during his service, though he frequently formed relationships with local women near the permanent forts where the legions were stationed, and these relationships often produced children who were legally recognized at the end of the soldier's wear. He was paid regularly, which sounds obvious, but was actually a significant administrative achievement that required a continuous supply chain stretching from Rome to wherever the Telive legion happened to be stationed. He was trained not only in fighting, but in construction, engineering, and medicine. Roman legions built the roads, the bridges, the aqueducts, and the forts that were the physical infrastructure of the empire. They were not merely a military force. They were a construction corps that could also fight, which is why Roman infrastructure was so good. The people building it were professionals who would have to use it themselves. The fate of the soldiers who came home, if they came home, tells you something about what Rome valued and how it tried to maintain the loyalty of the men on whom its power ultimately depended. After 20 years of service, a Roman legionary received a discharge payment that was large enough to buy a small farm, along with a grant of Roman citizenship, if he did not already have it, and the legal recognition of his children. He was then a free man, with property and citizenship and skills, integrated into the civilian economy of the province where he had served. Many veterans chose to stay near the forts where they had been stationed, and the civilian communities that grew up around permanent Roman military installations, called vici, frequently became the permanent cities that exist in those locations today. The city of York in England is the Roman fort of Eboracum. The city of Cologne in Germany is the Roman colony of Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, which the Romans had the mercy to abbreviate. Strasbourg, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, these and dozens of other European cities began as Roman military installations. The soldiers who built and garrisoned them stayed, raised families, and their descendants are still there 2,000 years later. The empire fell, but the soldiers' children remained, and in remaining, continued the project of Roman civilization under different names and different governments and different faiths, while maintaining the roads and using the legal frameworks and speaking the languages that Rome had left behind. The children of the empire, which is what every civilization that grew from Rome's remnants was, eventually built something Rome had not quite managed to build, a political framework for Europe that acknowledged both the legacy of Rome and the reality of the Germanic kingdoms that had replaced the Western Empire. Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 800 CE by Pope Leo III in Rome itself, was a Frank who spoke no Latin and ruled from Aachen in what is now Germany, attempting to reconstruct the Western Empire under the banner of Christian Rome. The title Holy Roman Emperor was used until 1806. The Roman Catholic Church, whose name contains the word Roman, and whose administrative structure was modeled on Roman provincial governance, is still headquartered in Rome. The legal codes of most European nations are derived from the Corpus Juris Civilis, the compilation of Roman law commissioned by the Eastern Emperor Justinian in 534 CE, over a century after the fall of the West. The language of the Catholic Mass was Latin until the Second Vatican Council in 1962. The concept of a unified European civilization with shared law and shared culture and shared administrative traditions is a Roman idea. And the fact that Europe has spent the last 70 Rome's longest echo, you are inside that echo right now. Not metaphorically, literally. The language you are hearing these words in is saturated with Latin. The legal concepts that govern your daily life are Roman in origin. The calendar that tells you what day it is was designed by Julius Caesar and refined by a Catholic, Pope, operating in the tradition of Rome. The city you live in, or the city nearest to you, is either built on a Roman foundation or shaped by the urbanization patterns that Rome established. The roads you drive on follow routes that Roman surveyors determined were the most efficient paths between important places. None of this is the kind of influence that announces itself. It is the kind that has become so deeply embedded in the structure of the world that it no longer feels like influence. It feels like reality, which is, when you think about it quietly in the dark, exactly the kind of influence that lasts. The question of why Rome fell has been debated since before it finished falling. Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, published between 1776 and 1789, ran to 6 volumes and attributed the fall primarily to the corrupting influence of Christianity and barbarism. Modern historians have offered explanations ranging from climate change to lead poisoning, from Roman pipes to pandemic disease, to the structural impossibility of governing an empire of that size without the communication technologies that would not exist for another 1,500 years. The most honest answer is that Rome fell for all of these reasons simultaneously, and that the combination of external pressure and internal weakness and administrative collapse and economic decline and military overextension and political instability was more than any system, no matter how well designed, could withstand indefinitely. Rome lasted as long as it did not, because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable, and because the idea of Rome, the story Rome told about itself, and the world told about Rome, was compelling, enough that people kept choosing to maintain it, even when maintaining it was difficult. That story is still being told. Every time a government builds a road, or administers a legal code, or coins a currency, or organizes a military, it is in some sense continuing a conversation that Rome began. The conversation is not about Rome specifically. It is about the questions Rome asked and tried to answer. How do you govern a large and diverse population? How do you maintain infrastructure across vast distances? How do you create a system of law that is both consistent enough to be predictable and flexible enough to address particular circumstances? How do you sustain a military force that is loyal to the state rather than to individual commanders? These are not Roman questions. They are human questions. Rome asked them earlier, and more systematically, and at larger scale than anyone before it. And the answers it found, imperfect and incomplete as they were, are still the foundation on which every subsequent attempt to answer the same questions has been built. The night is deep now. The empire is quiet. The Tiber still flows through Rome, as it has flowed for all of recorded history, and before, indifferent to the kingdoms that rose and fell on its banks. The aqueducts that brought water to the ancient city are silent, most of them, though the Aqua Vergine, rebuilt from a Roman original, still supplies the Trevi fountain today. The Colosseum stands in the Roman night, roofless, its upper arcades stripped of the bronze clamps that held its marble facing, the marble itself, long since taken to build the churches and palaces of medieval and Renaissance Rome. It is a ruin that has been a ruin longer than it was a functioning building, and it is still magnificent. The Forum, where Cicero made his speeches, and Caesar was cremated, and Augustus received the title that would be borne by every subsequent ruler of Rome, is a field of columns and broken pavements and excavated foundations where tourists walk in the morning, trying to imagine what it looked like when it was whole. History is a kind of archaeology, and the archaeologist always arrives after the fact, working from fragments. But the fragments from Rome are so numerous, so carefully preserved and studied and interpreted, that the picture they yield is more complete than for almost any other ancient civilization. Rome is the best documented catastrophe in Western history, which is part of why it continues to fascinate. You can almost see it whole. Almost. And the gap between almost and completely is where the imagination lives, filling in the missing pieces with what it knows, and what it guesses, and what it wishes were true. Let the imagination rest now. Let the forum settle back into its silence. Let the emperors sleep in their mausoleums, the good and the terrible alike, the long line of them from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus, all returned to the same earth that grew the crops that fed the legions that built the empire. The roads are quiet at this hour, as they were quiet at this hour 2,000 years ago, when the night watch made its rounds, and the fires of Rome burned low, and the people in their insulae turned in their sleep and dreamed whatever Romans dreamed about. They dreamed of the same darkness you are drifting toward now, the same quiet place behind the eyes, where the day releases its hold, and the mind does its ancient work of repair and restoration. They were there before you, many millions of them, across many centuries, lying down in the Roman night, and letting it take them. And the night took them, as it takes everyone, as it is taking you now, gently, without drama, with the simple and complete competence that darkness has always had for the business of rest. Let it. The empire rose, the empire fell, the night remains. Sleep now, sleep well. The Roman language deserves its own meditation, because Latin is one of the most extraordinary artifacts of the empire, a language that died as a vernacular sometime in the early medieval period, and has been alive ever since in the languages that descended from it, and in the law and the church and the academy that preserved it. Latin was not, when Rome was alive, the polished literary language of Cicero and Virgil. That was written Latin, High Latin, the language of educated Romans performing their culture in its most refined form. The Latin that legionaries spoke to each other in the camps along the Rhine, the Latin that merchants used in the markets of Alexandria and Carthage and Londinium, the Latin that enslaved people learned when they were brought to Rome from Greece or Syria or Britain, was a different thing. It was simpler, faster, full of slang and abbreviation and borrowings from the local languages it encountered in every province. This spoken Latin, which linguists call vulgar Latin, is the direct ancestor of every Romance language. It was not a degraded form of Cicero's Latin. It was a living form of Latin, doing what living languages do, which is change to meet the needs of the people who speak them. When the Western Empire fragmented into Germanic kingdoms in the 5th and 6th centuries, the Latin spoken in different regions continued to change, but now in isolation from each other, rather than in constant contact. The Latin of Roman Gaul became French. The Latin of Roman Iberia became Spanish and Portuguese. The Latin of Roman Italy became Italian. The Latin of Roman Dacia, which is modern Romania, became Romanian. Each of these languages is recognizably descended from Latin, carrying in their vocabulary and grammar the ghost of the language that Roman soldiers brought to their postings 2,000 years ago. When a Spanish speaker says ciudad, and a French speaker says cité, and an Italian speaker says città, and a Romanian speaker says cetate, they are all saying the same Latin word, civitas, meaning city, which also gives us the English word civilization. The word civilization itself is a Latin word meaning the condition of living in a city, which tells you something about what Rome thought was important and about what has been considered important ever since. English is not a Romance language, it is a Germanic language, descended from the Anglo-Saxon spoken by the Germanic peoples who settled Britain after the Roman withdrawal. But English absorbed an enormous quantity of Latin through the Norman conquest, which brought French to England in 1066, and through the influence of the Catholic Church, which used Latin as its official language throughout the medieval period, and through the Renaissance revival of classical learning, which flooded the emerging modern European languages with Latin and Greek vocabulary. Roughly 60% of English vocabulary is ultimately Latin or Greek in origin. The words you use for abstract concepts, for legal terminology, for medical and scientific vocabulary, for the names of months and days and planets, are overwhelmingly Latin. The word January comes from Janus, the Roman god of doorways and transitions. February comes from Februa, a Roman purification festival. March is Mars, the god of war. June is Juno, queen of the gods. The days of the week in English are named partly after Roman gods and partly after Germanic gods, a linguistic fossil of the cultural transition from Roman to post-Roman Britain. Saturday is Saturn's day, the Roman god of time. Sunday and Monday are the sun and the moon, universal astronomical observations. Tuesday through Friday are Germanic gods, Tiv, Woden, Thor, and Frigg, though in French and Spanish and Italian, the same days are named after Roman gods. Mardi is Mars's day, Mercredi is Mercury's day, Jeudi is Jupiter's day, Vendredi is Venus's day. The architecture of Rome changed the physical appearance of the Western world in ways that are still obvious if you know how to look. The arch is a Roman gift to architecture, or more precisely, Roman engineers refined and systematized the arch from earlier precedents and applied it at a scale that transformed what was structurally possible. The Colosseum is essentially a stack of arches. So are the Roman aqueducts, some of which still stand in France and Spain and North Africa, their stone arches carrying ancient water channels across valleys on piers that have stood for 2,000 years. The dome is a Roman invention in practical terms, though again, earlier precedents existed. The Pantheon's dome, cast in unreinforced concrete in 145 CE, remained the largest dome in the world for over 1,000 years, until Brunelleschi built the dome of Florence Cathedral in 1436, and Brunelleschi studied the Pantheon carefully before he did it. The great churches and cathedrals of medieval and Renaissance Europe are in large part the Sealand's children, inheriting the basilica plan, the dome, the coffered ceiling, the colonnade. When you stand inside St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, you are standing inside a building that is thinking about the Pantheon. Roman concrete, called opus caementicium, is another gift whose full significance has only recently been properly appreciated. Modern concrete begins to degrade after about 50 years. The Roman Pantheon's concrete dome has been structurally sound for 1900 years. Researchers studying ancient Roman seawall concrete have found that it is actually stronger than when it was first poured, because the seawater that percolated through it over the centuries caused chemical reactions that reinforced its crystal structure. Modern concrete, mixed with the volcanic ash that the Romans used in their formula, behaves the same way. Roman engineers had, apparently through trial and error and accumulated practical knowledge, rather than through any understanding of the underlying chemistry, invented a concrete mixture that improved with age rather than deteriorating with it. This discovery, published by material scientists in the early 21st century, has renewed interest in Roman construction techniques for a very practical reason. Concrete, that lasts 2,000 years, requires considerably less maintenance than concrete that lasts 50 years, and anything that reduces the maintenance requirements of modern infrastructure is worth understanding carefully. The Roman legal system is perhaps the deepest and most persistent of Rome's contributions to the world, because it addressed not how to build a building, but how to organize human relationships, and human relationships have not changed in the ways that engineering has changed. Roman law developed over roughly 1,000 years from the simple early code called the 12 Tables, posted in the Forum around 450 BCE, to the comprehensive Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian in the 6th century CE. The Corpus Juris Civilis was rediscovered in Western Europe in the 11th century, and its influence on the legal thinking of medieval and modern Europe was immediate and enormous. The distinction between public law, governing the relationship between individuals and the state, and private law, governing the relationships between individuals, is Roman. The concept of legal personhood, the idea that certain entities, like corporations, can have legal rights and obligations similar to those of individual persons, is Roman. The presumption of innocence, the burden of proof, the distinction between criminal and civil liability, the concept of contract, the rules of evidence, these are all Roman legal concepts that found their way into modern legal systems through the transmission of Roman law, through the medieval church, and through the Stein university law faculties that taught from the Corpus Juris Civilis from the 12th century onward. When a lawyer, anywhere in the Western world today, argues about the burden of proof or the terms of a contract, they are speaking a language that Roman jurists invented and Roman emperors codified and medieval scholars preserved and modern nations absorbed so thoroughly that its origin has become invisible. The Roman Catholic Church preserved Rome in ways that go beyond legal transmission. The Church is organized as a hierarchy that maps almost exactly onto the administrative hierarchy of the late Roman Empire, with the Pope in the position of emperor, cardinals in the position of imperial ministers, archbishops in the position of prefects governing large regions, and bishops in the position of governors of individual provinces. The Church used Latin as its official language until the 20th century, keeping alive a language that no one spoke as a mother tongue for over 1,000 years. The canon law of the Church was modeled directly on Roman civil law. The vestments worn by Catholic clergy preserve, in stylized form, the ceremonial dress of Roman magistrates. The basilica, the rectangular hall used by Roman magistrates for legal proceedings and commercial transactions, became the standard architectural form for Christian churches. When you enter a Catholic cathedral, you are walking into a building designed on the plan of a Roman courthouse, with the altar, where the magistrate's bench would have been, and the nave, where the litigants and spectators would have stood. The medieval church was, among other things, Rome, in ecclesiastical clothing, maintaining the structure of empire after the empire itself had dissolved. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century and spread across Europe over time, the following 2 centuries, was in large part an act of deliberate remembering. Renaissance humanists read Cicero and Virgil and Tacitus and Livy with the intensity of people recovering something precious that had been almost lost, and what they found in those texts reshaped art and architecture and political thought and philosophy in ways that still define Western culture. Petrarch, often called the first humanist, climbed Mount Ventoux in 1336 and described the experience in a letter modeled on Augustine, who was himself formed by Latin rhetoric and Roman philosophy. Machiavelli wrote The Prince in conscious dialogue with Roman history, drawing examples from Livy and Tacitus to illustrate his arguments about power. The founding fathers of the United States named their proposed republic after Rome's Republic, named the upper house of their legislature the Senate, gave it a design based on Roman precedent, and wrote to each other under Roman pseudonyms in the newspaper debates about the new constitution. The very idea of a republic, of self-government by citizens under law, was consciously understood by the American founders as a Roman inheritance that they were attempting to revive and improve upon. Rome was their reference point, their precedent, their warning, and their inspiration simultaneously, which gives you some sense of how rich and how contradictory the Roman legacy actually is. The Roman legacy is contradictory because Rome itself was contradictory. It was the civilization that produced Cicero's great speeches on justice and liberty, while relying on the labor of millions of enslaved people to support the class of citizens who had the leisure to appreciate those speeches. It was the civilization that codified the rule of law and then allowed emperors to ignore the law whenever it suited them. It was the civilization that built roads and aqueducts that improved the lives of millions of people, and used those same roads and that same organizational capacity to conquer and exploit those people. It was the civilization that gave the world one of the most sophisticated legal systems in human history, and that also fed people to lions for entertainment. It was, in other words, a human civilization with all the complexity and contradiction that phrase implies. Not the noble civilization of the marble statues, not the decadent civilization of Hollywood spectacle. Something considerably more difficult and more interesting than either of those. A civilization made of ordinary human beings, some of them capable and some of them terrible, and most of them somewhere in between, trying to make something that worked across an enormous span of time and territory, succeeding beyond any reasonable expectation, and eventually failing, as everything eventually fails, while leaving behind enough of itself to shape the next 2,000 years. Sleep is very close now. You can feel it in the loosening of the day's hold on the body, in the slowing of the thoughts, in the way the words you have been following are beginning to feel less urgent and more like a murmur, in a room you are moving through, rather than a story you are tracking. This is the right direction. Follow it. The empire that began with twins arguing over a hill and ended with a 14-year-old emperor being politely asked to stop has given you tonight's company in the dark, and it is good company, strange and vast and occasionally appalling and ultimately human in every relevant way. Human in its ambitions and its failures, and its creativity, and its cruelty, and its astonishing longevity, and its equally astonishing collapse. Human in the way all of us are human, capable of remarkable things and capable of terrible things and trying, within the particular constraints of our moment and our circumstance, to build something that lasts. The Forum is quiet at this hour. The Colosseum stands in its ancient silence. The aqueducts, those that survive, run their water through the Roman night as they have run it for centuries. The roads are still there, under the modern roads, the Roman stone beneath the asphalt, the old route, preserved by the simple logic that the most efficient path between two important places remains the most efficient path regardless of the century. The past is not behind you. It is beneath you, layer upon layer, the deep time of civilization compressed into the ground beneath your feet. And all of it, every layer, every century, every empire, and every ruin, has contributed something to the moment you are in right now, lying in the quiet dark, following the long, slow current of sleep toward the place where thought dissolves and the body does its simple ancient work of rest and repair, and the dreams that come from somewhere deeper than purest memory form themselves in the darkness behind closed eyes. The Romans dreamed there too, all of them. Emperor and slave and soldier and merchant and priest and child, all of them found their way to this same place every night. The same darkness, the same surrender, the same morning waiting on the other side. You are in good company. You always have been. Sleep now. The night is old. Let it take you. Sleep well. The gladiatorial games are one of the aspects of Roman civilization that most challenges the modern impulse to admire it, and they are worth thinking about honestly, rather than either excusing or simply condemning. The games, the ludi gladiatorii, began not as entertainment, but as a funeral rite. The earliest recorded gladiatorial combat in Rome, in 264 BCE, was staged by two brothers at their father's funeral, a ritual expression of grief and honor. 3 pairs of gladiators fought at that first recorded event. By the time of Julius Caesar, who staged games involving 320 pairs of gladiators to honor his late father, the scale had grown considerably. By the height of the empire, the Colosseum could seat 50 to 80,000 spectators, and the games could last for months, featuring not only gladiatorial combat, but animal hunts called venationes, public executions, and naval battles staged in the flooded arena. The Emperor Trajan celebrated his victory over the Dacians with games that lasted 123 days and involved 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals. These numbers are staggering. The logistical complexity of organizing games on this scale, the breeding and transport of exotic animals from across the empire, the training and maintenance of gladiatorial schools, the construction and operation of the Colosseum itself, is itself evidence of Roman organizational capacity that might otherwise manifest more admirably. The gladiators themselves were a more complicated reality than the Hollywood version suggests. The majority were enslaved people, condemned criminals, or prisoners of war who had no choice about their participation. A minority were free men who chose the career either from economic desperation or from the combination of fame and income that a successful gladiator could achieve. A skilled gladiator was a celebrity in the Roman world. Their names were carved on walls. People wrote declarations of love and admiration to famous fighters. Graffiti from Pompeii, preserved under the volcanic ash that buried the city in 79 CE, includes declarations like Celadus, "The Thracian makes the girls sigh." Gladiators had their own doctors and trainers and dietary regimens because a skilled gladiator was an expensive investment that the owner of the gladiatorial school, the lanista, had a financial interest in protecting. Most gladiatorial bouts, despite the popular image, did not end in death. A defeated gladiator could appeal for mercy from the crowd, and if the crowd indicated that he had fought well, the sponsor of the games would typically spare him, because a dead gladiator represented a significant financial loss, and crowds generally preferred to see the loser survive to fight another day. Death in the arena happened, certainly, but it was less routine than popular culture suggests. This does not make the games less morally troubling. People died in them, many thousands of them over the centuries, and many thousands more animals were killed in the hunts. The Christians, who were executed in the arena, died there because their refusal to participate in civic religion was treated as a capital offense. The whole institution was built on the willingness of Roman society to treat the lives of certain categories of human beings as disposable entertainment. The crowd that cheered for mercy for a brave gladiator was the same crowd that watched condemned criminals be killed without the option of appeal. The games reveal something true about Roman society that the aqueducts and the law codes do not. The systematic dehumanization of certain categories of people was not an unfortunate side effect of Roman civilization, but a structural feature of it. The question of how to hold both truths simultaneously, the aqueducts and the arena, the law codes and the slavery, the pantheon and the executions, is the central challenge of engaging seriously with Roman history. The answer is not to weight one side and ignore the other. The answer is to accept that this is what human civilization has always been, capable of extraordinary achievement and extraordinary cruelty, often in the same breath, often by the same people. Pompeii, which was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE and excavated beginning in the 18th century, is the most direct window we have into the daily life of an ordinary Roman city. The ash that destroyed Pompeii also preserved it, freezing a moment in time with a completeness that no other ancient site approaches. The streets of Pompeii are still there, the stepping stones that pedestrians used to cross the streets without wading through the court, waste that accumulated in the roadway, are still there. The ruts worn by cartwheels in the stone paving are still there. The thermopolia, the fast food counters, are still there, some with traces of the food that was last served in them, still identifiable. The houses, the temples, the bathhouses, the brothels, all still there, their walls in many cases still bearing the paintings and mosaics that decorated them. The graffiti, thousands of pieces of it, carved into walls throughout the city, electoral endorsements, insults, Declarations of love, advertisements, crude jokes, records of gambling wins and losses, complaints about landlords and neighbors, and the price of wine. Real people, real daily life, real concerns that feel startlingly familiar across 2,000 years of distance. The bodies of Pompeii are perhaps the most affecting aspect of the site. The victims of the eruption were buried in ash and pumice, and as their bodies decomposed over the centuries, they left voids in the hardened ash. When archaeologists poured plaster into these voids, they recovered the shapes of the people who had died there, in the positions they had been in at the moment of death. A man covering his face with his hands, a family huddled together, a dog straining at its chain, a pregnant woman. These plaster casts are not remains in the usual archaeological sense. They are the shapes of living people, captured in their last moment, still visible after 2,000 years. To look at them is to feel the 2,000 years collapse. They were people who went to sleep the night before the eruption, not knowing it was coming, worried about the ordinary things that people worry about. The price of bread, the behavior of a neighbor, the health of a child. And then the mountain that had always been there became something else, and the city that had always been there was gone. And 2,000 years later, we look at the shapes they left in the ash and we understand, in a way that no amount of political and military history quite achieves, that they were real, that they were us. The Pompeii dog, still on its chain, is perhaps the most quietly devastating image from the entire ancient world. The dog's owners fled, and could not, or did not, take the dog. The dog could not flee, because it was chained. The dog died alone on its chain, while the ash fell, and the sky went dark. The plaster cast of the dog, discovered in the late 19th century, and still visible in a display case in the site, shows an animal that died in evident distress, its body contorted, its expression, insofar as we can read expression in a plaster cast, one of pain and fear. The Romans treated dogs better than most ancient peoples. They kept them as pets and companions, not only as working animals. The image of Pompeii's house dogs appears in the mosaics of many Pompeian homes. The famous cave cannon mosaic, "Beware of the Dog," with its image of a black dog on a leash, is still there in the entrance of the house of the tragic poet. The dog that died on its chain is a reminder that the people who fled Pompeii were people who kept dogs and loved them and were forced by circumstance to leave them behind. The history of Rome is not only emperors and legions and aqueducts, it is also people and their dogs, and the ordinary losses that catastrophe inflicts on ordinary lives. Sleep is fully here now, not approaching. Here, the words are becoming something you rest inside rather than something you follow. This is the right place. The empire has been told, and the empire is quiet, and everything it built and destroyed and left behind is settling into its proper distance. Not behind you, because the past is never entirely behind anyone, but at a manageable remove, where it can be appreciated without demanding anything. The forum in its silence, the roads in their ancient logic, the languages that carry Latin like water, carries the shape of the riverbed through which it has always run. And you, at the end of a story that took 12 centuries to happen, and an evening to tell, at the edge of the place where all stories pause, and the body takes over from the mind, and the night does its necessary work. Let it do its work. Let the forum be silent. Let the Colosseum stand in the dark. Let the dog on its chain be finally freed from the chain in whatever peace exists on the other side of 2,000 years. Let everything settle into the dark and the quiet and the simple fact of being here, in this body, in this night, with this breath going in and out, as it has always gone in and out, as it has been going in and out since long before there was a Rome to build roads and write laws and tell stories about itself. Just the breath, just the dark, just the long, slow drift to the place where nothing is required and everything is given, and the morning is already there, waiting on the other side of the dark. You are already there. Sleep, sleep now. Sleep well.